I'm Dr. Tasia White, and you're listening to Things My Boss Never Told Me.
Hello, and welcome to episode number 5 of Things My Boss Never Told Me. I am your gracious host, Dr. Tasia White, and I am really excited about today's topic. So I sort of feel like we're at the halfway point, like this is the midterm. We've covered some different concepts up until this point, like leadership versus management, transactional versus transformative leadership. We even did a little detour into mindful leadership. And now we're kind of bringing all of those topics together to talk about understanding our own leadership and really owning our leadership. So not just identifying what makes us unique, but really owning it and demonstrating why that is so important. And I feel like, this is the midterm because what we're doing is bringing all of these concepts together before we transition to the next phase of this season, which focuses mostly on team development and team building. And I really felt like it was important for me to really spend some time on this particular topic because it was so instrumental for me in terms of my own progression into leadership. And there's actually a little story that I want to start with. So let's rewind to the summer of 2013. And at this point, I had just finished my master's in December, and I had accepted a promotion at the institution that I was at as a director of living and learning. So one of the things that I found to be very helpful for me in my own leadership journey is transparency. And at the beginning of that academic year, I made it known to my supervisor that I'm going to be finishing my master's at the end of this semester, and then by the next semester I will likely be looking for jobs, which he could understand. At that point, I had been in my position for about 3 years as an entry-level housing area coordinator, and so it naturally seemed to make sense that I would want to move on, especially since I had my degree under my belt. However, unbeknownst to me, my higher-ups were working on another plan, and that plan involved promoting me to the director of living and learning. And I was really excited about that position because it was new, it was different, the position literally had not existed before. But that's not the focus of the story. What I really want to focus on is what happened within a month or two of being in that position. So as you can imagine, when you start a new role, there are a lot of, anxieties that surround it, right? And luckily for me, because I had already been at the institution, that alleviated the whole process of having to get to know people, get the lay of the land and things like that. However, it was still a very new position for me. And the person who had aspects of that position retired. And although I worked closely with her, there were a lot of nuances that we just never touched on. So there was a lot that I needed to learn. And with me being such an overachiever, I really, really focused on just trying to do the job right, trying to get it all done perfectly. And it really took a toll on me and my energy. And I think others were starting to notice that. One day in August, I came into work and the dean, who was my boss's boss, came to me and was like, "Good, I'm glad you're here. I want you to go ahead and put your stuff down, get settled, and whenever you're ready, we're going to get a cup of coffee." And he sounded very stirred about it. And so I was like, okay, sure. I didn't know what was happening. And so at this point, I had been in the position for almost 2 months. Checked in with my supervisor, let him know that I was going to have coffee with his supervisor and I would be back whenever we were done. And so we walk over to the coffee shop just in the other building across from where our offices were. So he sat me down and he was like, we picked you for this role for a reason. We know that you have a lot to offer to this position, but I need you to do me a favor. I need you to own it. Own this job. Own it. And he just kept repeating that. And at the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I was just like, what do you mean own it? I'm here. I'm in the role. I'm doing the job. However, since then, I have come to learn that owning it meant put my stamp on it, show up authentically in who I need to be as a leader, as opposed to trying to replicate what the person before me tried to do, or to try to be something that I thought they wanted. I just needed to be me because they hired me, they picked me for the role. And so I just needed to show them more of who I was. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Now, I'll be completely honest. It took me a little while to really own my leadership. I mean, it took me a while to even understand what that meant. So let alone now trying to discover who I was as a leader, that took a little bit more time. And my hope is that by the end of this episode, you would be able to get to your own understanding much faster than I did and use the tools that I will discuss today to help you with creating your own leadership brand. Okay. So I believe that there are 3 key elements to owning one's leadership. The first one is knowing thyself. The second, showing up authentically. And the third being continuous assessment and growth. So let's go ahead and break those down individually. Okay, so step 1, know thyself. So there are 3 specific areas I want to make sure we talk about as it relates to knowing yourself. Now, hopefully you're not surprised that this is where we're starting, right? Because I feel like in all of the episodes leading up to this one, I've essentially hinted at this idea of getting a sense for who you are as a leader, who you are at your core. And so the first thing that we need to focus on as it relates to knowing ourselves as leaders is understanding what our values are. What is it that we care about and how is that presented in a professional setting? Now, there may be some who already know what their values are. Great, you're ahead of the game. However, if you were like me and hadn't really thought about it, you maybe need some help with trying to identify what your core values are. And one of the activities I found to be most helpful actually comes from the book, The Buddha and the Badass, which I referenced in episode number 1. And in the book, author Vishen Lakhiani suggests looking at significant experiences that we had and essentially coming up with a single word to describe that experience. And ideally, it's something that had a huge impact on us or something that just really stands out as being crucial for our development. Taking the time to look back at our lives and identifying these maybe 10 to 12 specific experiences. And then once you have your 10 to 12 words, seeing if there are any similarities between the words. And this was an activity that I did when I was identifying my own values, specifically for Vonni coaching and consulting. There were some other activities I had done over the years. You know, some other ones are like more interactive, like the values auction, which is an activity I would do with my staff members just to kind of get a sense for what it is that they truly value. And there's another activity of just kind of looking at a list of values and figuring out which ones stand out to you. However, I think the activity of looking at my past experiences was more personal. I didn't feel like someone was suggesting a value to me. I identified the value. So if you're looking to identify your values in a more personalized way, I highly recommend doing this activity. And I believe there is a YouTube video that walks you through this process. I will include that video on my website for you to check out at your convenience. Now, when I did this activity, I identified 5 themes that essentially became the 5 values of Vonni coaching and consulting. Now, those values may vary from person to person. Some individuals may have 5, 6, 7, 8 values, while some may have maybe 4. But the idea is just to figure out what is it that you feel best describes who you are. And the part that's really cool is that you have these stories that support these particular values because you took the time to think about the different experiences that you had that really stood out to you. And so when you tell stories about your values, you already have something to point to. Now, granted, when would you be telling stories about your values? I don't know. But I at least liked having the idea of connecting my value to situations in my life that were very important to me. And so my hope is that when you do this activity, you will have the same sense of connectedness to the values that you identify. Okay, that covers values. Now, the next part that is important as it relates to knowing who you are is understanding what your strengths are. What do you do well? What are you proficient in? And many of us may already have an idea of what that is. Let's say if you notice certain people come to you for certain things, like you can consider that a strength. Like I know for me, a lot of my friends and family come to me for like problem solving. And granted, I didn't necessarily know that's what it was. I thought they were just kind of getting my advice on things. But the more I looked at it closely, the more I realized is, oh yeah, I am really good at problem solving. Like I can come up with some creative solutions to all kinds of problems. So that's something I can add in the strengths category. Another strength that I have is that I'm a good listener. And it's more than just hearing what the person is saying, but it's also making the other person feel heard. And that's something that I do pretty well. It's something other people have complimented me on. And so therefore I can take that as a strength of mine. Now, the tricky thing about strengths is that we don't necessarily want our strengths to be things that people have validated us on. However, it is helpful to have specific situations or scenarios that we can point to where we can say, this is a strength of mine because this is how I handled this, and this was the outcome. So while we want to look at what other people admire about us, we also want to make sure that we have other supporting factors to signify that that is a strength of ours. On the other hand, we could use a more objective approach by utilizing assessment tools to help us identify our strengths and then connecting our experiences to the strengths identified from the assessment. So a prime example of that would be utilizing a tool like Clifton Strengths, which I believe is done through Gallup. And if you're unfamiliar with Clifton Strengths, which I believe was previously called Strengths Quest, it's essentially an assessment where you respond to a series of statements and you have to select on this scale which statements you identify most with. Now, Gallup has identified 34 strengths, and this assessment is essentially determining which of these 34 strengths are in your top 5. Now, the complete assessment doesn't rank all 34 of them, and so if you want to do the extended version, they will show you all 34 from, your top 5 strengths to which one is your 34th strength. But the initial assessment is just really focusing on those top 5. And the first couple of times I did this assessment, I only looked at the top 5. However, in preparation for this episode, I did do the complete assessment to see where everything else fell. And it was interesting for me because the first 2 times I had done the Clifton Strengths, there were 2 to 3 strengths that were consistent. So like learner, relator, and adaptability were somewhere in my top 5 in the first 2 times that I've taken it. However, in this more recent one, I've looked at the top 10 and noticed that some of the other strengths that weren't in my top 5, let's say from the first time to the second time, were still in my top 10. So for example, the very first time I took the Clifton Strengths, self-assurance was my number 1 strength. However, when I took the assessment the second time, that was no longer in my top 5. Now, since taking it a third time, it's still within my top 10, but it's not in the top 5 like it was the very first time I took the Clifton Strengths. And what I appreciate about this assessment is that it does give you some really rich information about how these particular strengths may manifest in your life. For example, the thing that really stood out to me about being a learner, and I laugh about it now, because it was like, yes, this totally describes me. But it said that with being a learner, like you might have been the type of child who liked to play school when you were younger. And I was like, oh my gosh, that was totally me. Like my poor cousin Brittany had to endure me playing school with her after she had already spent an entire day of school because she was just there. And granted, I tried to make it a little bit fun and interesting, like, showing her how to use my bake oven, or, we'd go on field trips to my grandmother's house. So it wasn't like traditional school, but we were still playing school at the end of the day. And essentially what the description was that I just have a thirst for knowledge and sharing knowledge. And I think that totally aligns with who I am and even with my values. Like edification is one of the values of Vonni coaching and consulting. So, to me, it all makes sense. Again, the Clifton strengths is just a more objective way to identify our strengths, but it should also be connected to specific experiences. So let's say if you were to do that assessment, identifying some experiences or scenarios that support that particular strength is really crucial. And if you're interested in learning more about the Clifton strengths, I will include a link on my website. Okay, so that covers step 2 of knowing ourselves. Step 3 is knowing our intentions. And this is something that we should already be familiar with because we talked about this in episode number 2. Our intentions really speaks to what it is that we are trying to do, what it is that we are trying to accomplish while we're in these roles. And so if we don't know what our intentions are, where are we going? We need our intentions to act as a compass to point us in the direction in which we want to go in. And so the sooner we can sit down and determine what our intentions are, the easier it will be in terms of fully understanding who we are. And then ideally, we're taking all of this knowledge that we're learning about ourselves and essentially sewing it all together. Like earlier, I mentioned that edification is one of the values for my company, and I'm able to connect that to being a learner as one of my strengths. And one of my intentions as a leader is to educate the people that I'm leading, is to give them the knowledge that they need to go forward so that they no longer need me as a leader. They're able to take that information and help lead others. And so knowing who we are is so crucial for our leadership brand. We have to know who we are in order to know where we're going, right? So just to recap, the 3 steps to know thyself is 1, identifying your values, 2, identifying your strengths, and 3, identifying your intentions. And sewing all 3 of them together to essentially create the story of who we are as leaders. Okay, so as you can see, that first element of owning our leadership is really doing that internal work to determine who we are. The next element is showing up authentically, doing the external work that helps us to convey who we are as leaders based on what we know about ourselves. And one thing I want to touch on before we jump into it is, for a long time, I really struggled with the word authentic or unapologetic. I felt like it was one of those buzzwords that a lot of people were using, and I was just sort of like, okay, but what does it mean? Like, okay, you're authentic, but what does being authentic mean? And it wasn't until I went to this conference and I was, hearing that buzzword quite a bit, or both of them, authentic or unapologetic. And when I was looking at how people were using it, it just sort of felt like an excuse for people to be rude. That sounds terrible. But I felt like it was just an excuse for people to say, well, this is who I am, take it or leave it. And I don't think that's right. I don't think that really is what it means to be authentic, or to be, maybe that's what it means to be unapologetic. But I think to be authentic is more so to convey our values in a consistent way, like expressing our values and our behavior in a very consistent way. I think that's what it means to be authentic, because you're showing up as the person that you say that you are. And so I wanted to kind of open up the second element with making that clarification, because again, I felt like authenticity or being authentic was just one of those buzzwords that a lot of people used. And I felt like it was important for me to explain, this is the context in which I am using this word. Being authentic is consistently demonstrating our values. That's it.
And once we take the time to get to know what those values are, we are able to set ourselves up to show up in that particular fashion. So in terms of showing up authentically, there are 2 ways that we do this. The first one being the verbal demonstration, and then the second being the nonverbal demonstration. So what does this look like? So in terms of a verbal demonstration, I believe we do that by communicating our boundaries and expectations. we set ourselves up for success by providing that information at the very beginning. I think it can be very hard to set boundaries when people are used to doing things a particular way. One of my old supervisors back when I was a student would always say, it's easier to lighten up than tighten up. And that's something that I actually repeated to my students because I found it to be so true. As a student, if I had a floor of 30 residents that I was responsible for managing and they felt like they could walk all over me, and then the moment I try to enforce a rule or policy, like they're going to just look at me and laugh, right? And so that was something that was instilled in me very early on in my leadership journey. And then as I progressed as a leader, I found that to continue to be true, that I needed to provide my staff with some kind of expectations for them, for our office, and just for how we operate as a team. And one of the ways that I would do that was I would give them a list of my expectations, but I complemented that with what they can expect from me as their leader. So not only was I letting them know what I wanted from them, I also gave them the heads up of what they can expect from me so that they understood that this was supposed to be a mutual relationship. So while I am holding them accountable to things, I also wanted them to hold me accountable to the things that I listed for them as their leader. And it was an open dialogue where I also asked them, what is it that they felt was missing? What expectations did they have of me that they wanted to include in this document? Then it became something that we were all holding ourselves accountable to. We established a sense of mutual accountability, which is something that I will talk about more when we get into the topics around team building, because mutual accountability has so much power. But for the context of this conversation, making sure that I demonstrated to them in a written form, these are my expectations, these are my boundaries, these are my standards, and I'm hoping that we can all agree on this and be able to function under these guidelines. And I found that to be really helpful because it really set the tone for what was going to be tolerated and what wasn't. And granted, you're going to have people who test the waters, who, try to challenge you, and that's totally okay. For the individuals that did challenge me, they didn't challenge me on the boundaries that I set. They challenged me in other ways. Like they challenged my thinking, they challenged my decisions, but they didn't challenge the expectations that I set for them. Nor did they challenge the boundaries that I set because I communicated that information in advance. So I feel like that's still a win. So in order for us to show up as leaders, we have to make sure that we know what our boundaries are and we know what our expectations are in advance and own that. One of the things I shared in a previous episode is that, I know that I had high standards in certain respects. And there were some people who didn't necessarily agree with it, but they respected it at the end of the day because they knew that while I had these high expectations for them, it was for their own good. I wanted them to do better. I wanted them to be better. I wanted them to be better leaders than I was. So naturally, the standards that I have set for them are going to be high. And in order to do so, I had to hold them to a higher standard than maybe some other people. And so I share all of this to say that having boundaries and expectations is important for us, and conveying that in a written form is also important for us, regardless of the resistance that we may receive from the people that we're managing. And if we're able to work with them in the same way that I described in terms of establishing some kind of mutual accountability, great. But we have to at least take that first step of letting them know what is and isn't okay under our leadership. Now, the second phase of showing up authentically is the nonverbal demonstration. And this is something we've already covered. Like we literally just talked about this in episode number 4. How we show up in our work environment sets the tone. So we have to make sure that we are showing up authentically by demonstrating our values and our behaviors as well. So while it's nice to have this written document, we need to back that up with our behavior. We can't say one thing and do another thing because that creates confusion. The goal here is consistency. If we're striving for consistency, then we have to make sure that we're being consistent in terms of what we're saying and what we're doing. For example, I know that I am not a morning person. Therefore, I never set the expectation of being to work on time. I cared more about the quality than the quantity. And if you needed to come in a little bit later and stay a little bit late, I was totally fine with that. Now, if you are the type of leader who has the expectation of being to work on time, then you have to also hold yourself to that standard. You also have to be on time because you have to model the behavior that you want from your team. Okay, so that's a very basic example. So let me try to sew all of the pieces together for you. So one of the things that I value is relationships, is people. I really enjoy getting to know people on an individual level. And that was actually one of my top strengths when I did the Clifton Strengths assessment. Being a relator, being an individualizer, and actually relationship building is one of the categories that they have for the strengths, and that's where I have the most number of strengths. Like I think 3 of my top 5 are in the relationship building category. So that tells you, not only is that something that I value, but it's something that I do well. So my verbal cue for setting the expectations around relationship building was letting my team know that we would have frequent check-ins with each other. And I saw our check-ins as an opportunity for me to really get to know them on an individual level. And it would be during those times that I would ask them about not only things within the work environment, but check in to see how things were personally. Now, obviously, I wasn't trying to be intrusive. I always left it up to them to decide how much they wanted to share. But I would ask general questions like, how's home life? How's your family? And as we developed a rapport and they shared more with me, I could be more specific and ask things like, how was your cousin's baby shower? Or how's your grandmother doing? Just leaving it up to them to decide how much they wanted to share, but letting them know that this is something that we will do very frequently because I wanted to take the time to get to know them. Now, the nonverbal cue for letting them know that I cared about developing the relationship with them was a little bit more subtle. So one of the things that I think is so important for communication is making people feel like they have your undivided attention. And so when I would meet with my team members individually, I often would make sure I had a good amount of time set aside for us, and I didn't have any clocks in my office. Now, for some people, that could be very nerve-wracking. But for me, I always relied on my phone to look at the time. And I would purposefully put my phone somewhere that it wasn't easily accessible because I didn't want to have the distraction of my phone there. Now, if I got a phone call or someone knocked on the door, that's one thing. But for the most part, I wanted to convey to them that they had my undivided attention. And that was my way of letting them know that I care about hearing how you're doing, what's going on, and how I can best support you. And so I'm going to give you my undivided attention. And for many people, that had a huge impact. I had one staff member who would often leave my office and, felt like it was a therapy session. I by no means have any credentials in that arena, but just because it was an opportunity for us to just really talk. And that was something that he never really had in a supervisor. And so he really appreciated that. We had this undivided time together to hash out whatever was going on, whether it was something that he was struggling with at work, or if he just wanted to vent about something that was happening personally. I just saw it as an opportunity for us to build a relationship and left it up to them to determine what facets of their life would be part of that relationship building. And then obviously I would reciprocate with things that I felt were appropriate so that it wasn't just me gathering all this information about them. I was letting them know what was happening in my life so that we were essentially developing a healthy rapport in the work setting. And again, this is something that I felt comfortable doing because it was a strength of mine. It was something that I valued. Therefore, it's something that came naturally to me. And that's going to vary from leader to leader. Like I think about someone like Mark Cuban from Shark Tank. I watched an interview with him fairly recently where he talked about how he builds relationships doing something similar in terms of getting to know the people within his company, but he takes it a step further and makes a point of remembering their child's birthday, their birthday, and their spouse's birthday. And then he would often give them a call to wish those individuals happy birthday. And that doesn't just stop with his team. He also does that for his colleagues outside of his company. So I believe that's an elevated version of relationship building in comparison to what I've shared in my approach. So again, it's going to vary from person to person. Now, before we move on to the third element of owning our leadership, I just want to briefly address this idea of leaders are supposed to look a certain way. hopefully by now I have conveyed to you that that's not the case. There isn't a standard for how a leader should look or how they should act. It really does vary from person to person, and it's up to us to determine how that looks for us. We can't leave it up to other people to tell us this is what a leader should look like. I think it's one thing to admire someone for their leadership approach. I think it's another thing to idealize them and for us to see ourselves as less than them because we don't have the qualities that they do. But here's the thing, we have to learn how to leverage our own qualities, the things that make us unique, and then therefore we can be at that level. We're not supposed to be them. While there may be things that we appreciate about them, we can learn those particular skills or try to adopt those values. But at the end of the day, it's really up to us to determine what is it that we feel is most important. And it's really up to us to be authentic and show the world who we are at our core. So while it's nice to have people to look up to, we also can't lose ourselves in the process. So instead of idealizing them, let's look at them as mentors and teachers who can help us enhance the skills that we have or bring out elements of leadership that we want to demonstrate more consistently. For example, I think about one of my previous supervisors who part of his leadership presence was he was very witty. Like his wordplay was seriously unmatched, and I really appreciated that about him. Another one of my supervisors was really good at storytelling, and he could just paint this picture for you, and we would all just take it all in because we could see it all coming together as he was describing it. I also had a colleague who was just so eloquent and engaging, and that's something that I truly appreciated about her leadership presence. So I share all of that to say we can admire the qualities that other leaders possess, but we shouldn't get lost in what it is that they have and see that as a deficit. Because at the end of the day, our experience is our experience. And we have to remember that there is always an opportunity to change. There's always an opportunity to enhance and learn and try something different. And that's actually the final element of owning our leadership. So just to quickly recap, the second element to owning our leadership is showing up authentically. And being authentic means consistently demonstrating our values. And we do that by demonstrating our values verbally in terms of setting standards and expectations, and then non-verbally in the behaviors and the role modeling that we're doing with our teams. Okay. The third and final element of owning our leadership is continuous assessment and growth. And hopefully you've gleaned by now that leadership isn't a vacuum. It really is cyclical. And each experience that we have is an opportunity for us to learn something new, gain a new perspective, and to try things differently. And we go through these different processes to help us grow and ultimately evolve as leaders. Because here's the thing, as we take on different roles, as we interact with different individuals, we're going to need to have as many different experiences to keep up with the changing world, the different generations. So in order for us to stay on our game, we have to make sure that we are actively participating in activities that enhance the qualities that we already have, but also gives us an opportunity to learn something new. So here is what I recommend for continuous assessment and growth. 1, participating in some kind of personal growth activity that reinforces our values or opens us up to a new perspective. So this could be doing something like reading a new book, taking some kind of course, or doing what you're doing right now, which is listening to a podcast. There are so many different opportunities for us to see what other perspectives are out there. If it's reinforcing what's already relevant to us, great. If it's opening us up to a new perspective, great. Ideally, we're just being active participants in terms of checking in on our values. My second recommendation would be to participate in some kind of professional growth activity that enhances our skills or helps us to build new ones. So I want to make sure that we identify the difference there. So the first one is finding activities that speak to our personal growth and values. However, with the second recommendation, looking at our professional growth and specifically focusing on skill development or skill enhancement. So let's say you want to develop a new skill and you're not sure where to start. Perhaps we can start with our teachers and mentors and ask them how they developed the skills that we admired about them. If they already possess a quality that we want to add to our repertoire, why not essentially start with them to determine how to best go about doing so? And then my third recommendation for continuous assessment and growth should not be a surprise to you because I've talked about it multiple times over multiple episodes. It's essentially having some kind of routine check-in with ourselves, making sure that our values are consistent with our expectations and they're consistent with our behaviors, and we're still conveying that message consistently. Because what all of this is doing is building our leadership brand. And we want to make sure that whatever we are doing, whatever we're saying is on brand with how we want to be perceived by other people. So doing that routine check-in is crucial. Like, think about the large organizations who have very specific brands. They make sure they take the time to ensure that any messaging that they put out, the people that they select to work at those organizations, or even the products that they're putting out are consistent with their brand. And so that's something that we need to also do too, as it relates to our leadership brand. So think of this last element as quality checks. Like, you're doing quality control for your brand to ensure that it's all consistent with who you feel like you are personally, how you want that to be portrayed, how that connects to the skills that you want to develop, and how you want to be perceived as a leader, and creating a feedback loop where you're able to determine where any adjustments may need to be made so that things are consistent across the board. And so that's it. Those are the 3 keys to owning our leadership. We have to make sure that we know who we are. We have to make sure we show up authentically. And we have to make sure that we're participating in continuous assessment and constantly growing to keep up with the changing world. So as I think about my own leadership brand, I recognize that it's a little unique, and that's the point. For me, I prefer to lead with love. I prefer to build relationships. There was this term that I came across in my doctoral studies, interpersonal credibility, and just latched onto it. So what is interpersonal credibility? According to Harold and Fetter, they define interpersonal credibility as qualitatively different relationships that leaders build over time with their followers. And they do this intentionally so that leaders develop trust. And this is particularly helpful in environments where change is facilitated on an ongoing basis. I found that establishing interpersonal credibility really helped me to facilitate the kind of change that was necessary for our environment. And when you have individuals who are resistant to change, having that skill is really important because they are trusting that whatever it is that you're trying to do is for a good cause, not just change for change's sake. And one of the things that's crucial about interpersonal credibility is the fact that it requires leaders to invest time to get to know their employees at the beginning of their relationship so that they eventually obtain buy-in. And the efforts have to be genuine. The leaders have to genuinely want to learn about their employees and be invested in their interests and their strengths and understand how they fit into the greater scheme. And that's something that we've been talking about from day one, really looking at how we can best utilize the people on our team and see them as a whole, and in various ways, letting them know that their contributions are important for the team. So establishing interpersonal credibility is essentially my intention. And
And the fact that relationship building is one of my strengths, and I value people and relationships, like it all is interconnected. And this was actually a topic I would share very frequently with my students. Like when I was asked to speak at a leadership retreat, I touched on this topic and how I recognized its importance very early on in my leadership journey, even before I had a name for what it was that I was doing. And I'm sharing all of this to invite you to really sit down and think about what your leadership brand is. So for me, it's leading with love, building relationships, making people feel like they're part of something greater. What is your leadership brand? And how do you go about conveying that to the individuals that you're leading or that you want to lead? Let's say if you're not necessarily in a leadership role, but you want to, what do you want that to look like? Really sit down and think about your leadership brand and how you want to be remembered. So that's my homework for you today, participating in a little visualization activity where you think about how you want to be remembered as a leader. And then use the steps that I talked about in this episode to get to that point.
So going back to the story that really inspired this topic, I will admit it took me a little bit of time to find my stride. However, once I left that position, I had a very good understanding of my brand. And I think that really made a world of a difference when I made the transition from that position, which was mid-level, into a senior level position at another school. I could see the difference. I could see the growth. And I attribute much of that to just really investing the time to get to know myself and observing what are the things that are working and not working for me, and ultimately crafting a leadership presence that best fit me, which was ultimately the assignment, right? That is what he was getting at when he told me to own it. And now I'm telling you to own it. Own your leadership presence. And remember that it's not about being someone else. It's really about honoring who you are and demonstrating that to the world, to the people that you're interacting with, to your colleagues and to your employees. One of my favorite quotes from the motivational speaker, Lisa Nichols, is, "No one can do you like you do." And that's it. No one can be the type of leader that you are. So why not you do you the best way you know how? Show up as your most authentic self in the work environment and know that who you are is a unique and talented being, and no one can do it like you do. That's the message I want you to take away from this episode today. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into this episode's gratitude list. First and foremost, I am grateful for Nuker and his pep talk. I always appreciated his tough love approach, and that morning that we sat and had coffee will forever be ingrained in me because I really felt like he was really encouraging me and it was truly appreciated. So thank you, Steve. Second, I am grateful for the experiences, good and bad, that have shaped my values. I believe that everything happens for a reason, and while I may not have enjoyed certain experiences in the moment, I recognize that they were so crucial for my development. So I'm grateful for those experiences, regardless of how it all turned out. Third, I'm grateful for the opportunities that have enabled me to reinforce my leadership brand, like this podcast, my Instagram page, or even with the people that seek out my advice and counsel. It just signifies to me that my brand resonates with individuals, and I'm truly grateful for that. Okay, now let's get into this week's affirmation. And similar to some of the other ones, it's going to be a fill in the blank. So here it is. I am a blank leader who values blank, and my intention is to blank. So ideally, you're filling in these blanks with the pieces that we have talked about in this episode. So I am a blank leader, so highlighting a strength, who values blank, inserting some kind of value, and my intention is to blank. So just letting people know what your intention is. So let's do that one more time. I am a blank leader who values blank, and my intention is to blank. And I am purposefully leaving these blanks because this is ultimately your brand statement. I want you to have a brand statement, something that you can share with individuals, whether it be in an interview
or when you're starting a new position and you want to give people a sense for who you are, you can start with this statement right here. And it's a very concise description of what it is that you bring to the table. So make sure you write this down, put it somewhere where you can be easily reminded that this is part of your leadership presence. This is your leadership brand. Okay, so that wraps up this episode. And now that we've focused a lot on the individual side of leadership, we're going to be transitioning to the next phase, which is focused on team development and team dynamics. And that's an area I enjoy a lot. So I am really excited for us to spend the next couple of episodes focusing on team development and team dynamics. So stay tuned. All right. Thank you so much for listening and have a great day.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Things My Boss Never Told Me. Before you go, please make sure that you like and subscribe down below. Also, I included a few recommended videos for you to check out. Thank me later.